I'm very motivated to try and bring to life these values that we talk a lot about, but that I know through my work that we're not authentic, we don't bring them to life for everyone. First Nations are the price that has been paid for where Australia is today and all the beautiful things that we have. They actually are, they've paid the price for that. Okay. There were over 150 athletes who were rounded up, and many of them, we know that Hakeem was tortured, and many other alleged they were tortured.
Craig Foster, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Yeah, great to chat with you, Gary.
You're probably wondering what you're doing on a true crime podcast called I Catch Killers.
I am a bit. I'm a bit worried.
Well, can I just have a shot? Is there any offence or crime you want to admit to? It's just old habits if there's an easy kill.
Good question.
Okay, so I'll take that as a denial.
That's right.
Craig, you're, I think why, and coming on a true crime podcast, and what I'm interested in talking to you about is you very much campaign for injustices. And what you see in the world of true crime is a lot of injustice. Mm-hmm. So I think it sits very nicely in a true crime podcast and the type of things that you've done. It's quite strange. You're probably more well known as a human rights activist than you are as a professional footballer, and you had a very high profile.
Yeah,
so,
I think that's right.
What gave you that sense of social justice?
That's a difficult question that I've never really been able to adequately answer. You know, a lot of people have asked it, of course, when they've seen me involved in high-profile campaigns, and I know you want to speak specifically about one of the highest profile, and that's around Hakeem al-Araibi back in 2018-19. But, I don't know. The best I can come to say is perhaps that I'm from the country area. I'm from regional Australia, Lismore up in far north coast, a beautiful area, but a very small community and a very tight-knit community, a country area back in the 70s and early 80s. And what I took out of that and saw was just this sense that, firstly, everyone was equal. Secondly, that anyone would step forward to help others in the community, and in fact there was an expectation to do that. So I remember everyone coming out, and if someone had a problem, with a house or in the sporting community and facilities, everyone would come out and provide their competencies and their skills for the benefit of the community. And if people were having social, family or other issues, everyone would step forward to help them. And we had a very large extended family out there in a beautiful place called Dunoon and Wine, and on the farms in those times, people literally couldn't survive if the family next door and the family 5 k's away weren't going to help lend their tractors, share their food and their equipment, and therefore that just kind of underpins, the way I see the world.
The value of it. And I suppose the world view, and because you have been a professional footballer, you've got a good take on the world because you get to see you've seen a lot of it. Australia, we like multiculturalism. We think of ourselves as, fair go, everyone fair go. But to me, I think there's an undercurrent of racism in that. We're a little bit naive. We think we give everyone a fair go, but I don't necessarily see that. What's your take on multiculturalism in this country and how we deal with it?
Yeah, it's a great question. We're just starting to have conversations about what multiculturalism really means, and not just to us, and by myself I would say, a white Anglo-Australian, grew up in Lismore, who comes from a British heritage, both sides of my family, back in the 1820s. But what multicultural communities, so all of our ethnic communities, what they think about what Australia means to them and how what their sense of belonging is about. And we've never really asked that as a country. Don't forget, it's only 50 years, actually, this year, so 1973, this year is the 50-year anniversary of Australia's first multicultural policy under Gough Whitlam. And that really marked the end of the White Australia policy, which was to restrict our immigration, to restrict non-European white migration effectively through in different forms and in different quantums, if you like, throughout from 1901 till the 70s. It lasted all that time.
White Australia policy.
White Australia. So, it's not a long time ago. And therefore, of course, it's natural that has, underpinned a lot of cultural and political and social thinking. That's natural. And so we're just starting to, on the cusp now of multicultural communities finding their voice. Because, if you talk about 50 years, so then, post-Second World War, many of my football communities, so, many Western European communities came here, and now you've got the second generation and just starting the third generation. So as that process is occurring, you've got migrants here who now have come into Australia. They've been born in Australia. They see things a little bit differently. They're much more organised now, and they're starting to now call for two things, access and representation. And what that means is power, essentially. It means to have representation of all of our 300 different cultural backgrounds in parliaments, all around the country, state, territory and federal, and in media and in board level. It's about them saying to us now, okay, it's time that we also had a voice and we were listened to. And that's a big, that's a wonderful journey for Australia, a bit like what we're seeing with The Voice. That's the next step for a conversation.
Yeah, well, I want to talk to you on the indigenous issues later on, but I think you described the immigration, the second generation and all that. Then you played football. I played football, soccer, and when I was playing, it was called wog ball. You were
exactly.
Basically
whereabouts were you?
Around Gladesville, Hornsby, and down there. So they would, if you played soccer, and it was said as you're playing wog ball because it was an Italian game, and we didn't embrace it. But then generation after generation, it's changed, and the Italians, and you see say black Africans immigrating now, and people are looking at it going, they're so different, we don't understand their culture. That's what it was when the Italians came over in those times, and you would have seen it in football.
Yeah, that's right. So often, I do a lot of speaking in, government, NGOs, schools, corporations, and so on about anti-racism, multiculturalism, human rights, and all of these types of things, which are all linked. And I often show a picture of, a football, like me playing in the Socceroo strip, or perhaps for Crystal Palace, for example, and say, look, I'm in not unique, but in a quite rare position as a white Australian Anglo, because I've spent 40 years of my 54 years in multicultural Australia. And that was what you say used to be called the wog ball game. So football was multiculturalism, and therefore it brought to life almost all of our immigration, because almost every country or ethnicity, nationality that comes to Australia comes with a love of football. Save just a very few finite small places around the world, like subcontinent India, for example, might be cricket. But football captures most of our immigration. And when those communities came to Australia, the part of their integration into Australian society was through their football clubs. They would have their religious, community, perhaps church. They would have some community organisations. But the fundamental centre of most of these communities was their football club. And therefore, football rightly became synonymous with immigration and immigrants. Therefore, it became the immigrant game and the wog ball game. But what Australia has never come to terms with is that, our history of immigration has been quite tortured. And, on a cyclical basis, and refugees are a great example in the last 20 years. But when Italians came here, when Greeks came here, under the White Australia policy, they were called swarthy. They were said, look, we consider them basically white, but they've got olive skin, and therefore they're not white enough. And so therefore, when these people came to Australia, they suffered a huge amount of racism about their food, about their language, about their accent, about their dress, about their religions, all of these things. So you talk to all of our multicultural communities, they tell you the same thing. That, for many of them, of course, they're saying, look, we were grateful to be here and we love this place, but we were racially vilified, and we had to live with that. And so now we've got to the place where football has kind of moved a bit past that, but the country has never acknowledged that the game of football actually allowed all of these communities to integrate into broader Australian society. So the game of football essentially tracks the immigration of Australia.
Yeah, I'm glad you explained it that way, because you articulated it very well, because I think it's misunderstood or not realised the importance that football played.
Very much so, yeah.
And I like examples. I'd see people that come out that, and we've had guests on here on I Catch Killers, Deng Audit. I don't know if you know Deng.
Yep.
He from Sudan. He was
Yes.
a boy soldier. Came over here. And he was telling us the story of not just what he went through in his own country, but the battle to get out here.
Yes.
Then he got to Australia, landed, and couldn't speak the language. Everyone looked at him as strange, and he was having a hell of a time. And he found football. And I think Marshall Soper, who you would know,
Marshall,
he coached him. And
Really?
that made him feel like part of a community. He
that's
said
right.
it turned his life around.
Yeah, so all of sport has that ability, and sport is very undervalued in terms of its ability to assist integration and people's sense of belonging and acceptance by a community and breaking down those barriers. So, Deng Aduit, I think he's a lawyer as well.
Yeah,
And so what it allows them to do is to come into this safe environment where we all just love to play this particular thing. And by playing together, we start to just naturally break down those barriers. Over time, we get to know each other, and the stigmas and the prejudice and the racism should, over time, start to break down. And we've certainly seen that's the case.
Racism, I think, is born by ignorance.
That's true.
It's people it's something they're not familiar with, so therefore they shy away from it. And I think you break down those barriers. And I saw it, you talk at the level you played football. I saw it just in amateur football.
Mm-hmm.
We'd have people from South America come over and
Yes.
play in the team. A completely different approach to the football.
Exactly.
Different approach to life. And at first, everyone's a little bit standoffish. By the end of the season, everyone wants to be like that. They were cool dudes. But
That's right,
all the different experiences, and I
Yeah.
think it's just that
Very much
fear
so.
and ignorance that turns people away.
That's true. So I often say that football is a huge gift to all of us because it is the game in Australia. And when you play for Australia, as you rightly said, I played 29 times. So let's say, 9 of those might be here. So I had 20 occasions to travel the world, see other countries, go onto the field against another culture, against another nationality, against another religion, and come to know those people. And so for us, it gives us a global worldview. It sends us all around the world, which is not the same for all sports. And so we also feel that it does that for Australia. So if you look at the Women's World Cup, for example, now for the Matildas to be competing on that global stage gives us an opportunity to understand the other cultures, also for the rest of the world to understand who we are. So when our national teams go, they very much go as, kind of symbols of what Australia is and what we care about.
Yeah.
Which is why it's good to see now that, for instance, our Matildas are talking about, First Nations issues and that we're bringing to life, the 65,000-year history of the country through our international sporting pursuits. That's very, very, Kathy Freeman and others. That's because essentially what we're doing is telling the world this is who we are. We're here to kick a ball against you, but we want to know who you are and you need to know who we are. And we're going to do that through this safe space of sport where the rules are agreed, which is not always the case, and we all feel safe in this environment so we can start to just have different conversations.
And it does just break down those barriers, doesn't it? Okay, let's, on the podcast, we like to find out a little bit about our guests, and I'm looking at you, and I've got here a very high achiever. Let me just run through a couple of things here, Craig. So 18 years as a professional soccer player. You played 29 games for the Socceroos. You were the 419th cap player, which is a nice thing. I like how they keep
It's nice,
that record, isn't it?
Gives you a sense of your position in history.
And the lineage. And you also captained the Socceroos, former chairman, life member and CEO of Professional Footballers Australia. You won 3 Logies. Multi-talented here. Human rights activist, which we're going to talk in detail about. You're also an author, fighting for Hakeem, which we'll talk about, FOS on football. You've got a law degree, a master's degree in international sports management. And you're even the New South Wales State recipient for the Australian of the Year in 2023. What drives you?
Well, I just think that I've been very fortunate in life. Even where I came from, I had a safe environment. I had a loving family. I was provided. We didn't have much means. We were in the country area, but my father was a motor mechanic. But everything that we needed was provided for us in one way or the other. We had a safe upbringing in a wonderful community up there in Lismore, and then was able to play for the country, go into television, go into broadcast, and on. And so I just think that, we've been provided with a lot of gifts, very few barriers. So, I never faced racism.
Yep.
I didn't face intergenerational disadvantage. We weren't poor. We were a working class. And so I haven't had to live on the street. I wasn't sexually abused as a kid, as you would know.
Yep.
Many people who end up being incarcerated come through these types of traumas,
Yep.
and they never are able to overcome it, and that leads them into a different path. So my path has been very smooth, and the older I grew, I saw many people whose path was very different to mine,
Yep.
and started to understand the concepts of disadvantage, of racism, of systemic oppression, and how racism can hold various people down. And so therefore I feel and plus I also, having played for Australia, when I grew up, coming up in Lismore country area, playing sport was huge, right?
Yeah.
It was a big sporting area, and therefore the great goal for everyone was to be good enough to play for your country.
Yeah.
And everyone had a particular view of what Australia was. So we used to watch the cricket and Alan Border, and my dad loved that, and and we would get together as a family, everyone watching. And there was this sense that this is, these people represent what Australia is about.
Yeah.
And as I grew older, I started to, and through the law degree, of course, started to increasingly recognise that we don't always live up to those ideals that we talk about. And so, for those two reasons, what I've been given, and also, and other people don't have, and also where we fall short as a country, I'm very motivated to try and bring to life these values that we talk a lot about, but that I know through my work that we're not authentic, we don't bring them to life for everyone.
Yeah.
And therefore that means standing up for vulnerable people, that means talking about First Nations, racism, intergenerational disadvantage, the truth of our history, and all of that kind of coalesces into where Australia's headed, and that's why I'm the co-chair of the Australian Republic movement, because I believe that it's the ultimate place for Australia to evolve into is where we're proud of our own society, we're a unique country, multicultural, reconciled with history, and standing on our own.
Yeah. And I think the fact that you've acknowledged that your upbringing on that and the journey, and you look back, and it's very easy to, with all that you've achieved, you could sit on your laurels and go, "Oh, I've done this, done that." But when you look back, and something that's opened my mind up since I've left the police, and a lifetime in the police, locking up the bad guys. Now I'm sitting down talking to some of the bad guys here and getting to know them, and you talk about that disadvantage in the childhood. And some of the stories I've heard in this very room, that if I went through that, God knows how I would have turned out.
Totally right.
And it's almost like those of us that have had the life that haven't had those traumas and dramas in their lives, we owe it to people to at least understand where they're coming from. And it sort of changed my view. So I can I hear where you're coming from, very much understand it. So Lismore, you would have had Byron Bay, the hippie culture. You would have had an eclectic Nimbin around there. Did you ever experience what was happening at Cabbage Tree Island at the Mission, an Aboriginal area down there? It's a little, I think, a bit south of there. I've done some work there, and it's just when we talk about indigenous issues and that, and how we've handled immigration, but it all comes back to how we first settled here and the way that we treated our Indigenous people. What's your views on Indigenous issues?
I think you're absolutely right. So the big issue that Australia is trying to face in 2023 with the Uluru Statement and Voice to Parliament is we're wrestling with, and there's a lot of argument and polemics and so on. I think a lot of that is natural because we're talking about 235 years of history where we simply didn't want to acknowledge the birth of post-colonial Australia. So, we now increasingly recognise the 65,000 years of history, and we have a lot of Indigenous First Nations art everywhere. You go into the Commonwealth Bank head office or any head office in the country, you'll see massive...
Starting to acknowledge it.
We're doing welcomes to country, acknowledgement to country, and smoking ceremonies and all these things. And they're all important because it's step by step just normalising discussion and respect for, First Nations culture. But the one thing that we've never wanted to talk about, haven't been willing to talk about, and have been in denial about is the fact that the country was invaded and stolen and First Nations were massacred. In fact, in Tasmania, there was, under international law, and although the concept of genocide didn't come around till, I think, post-Second World War, about 46, 48, on the basis of what that means is trying to wipe out a people, wipe out their culture, or even it means trying to wipe out their bloodlines by making them more white, for example, putting Aboriginal kids in white families and trying to breed out the indigeneity. Those are actual definitions of genocide today. And that certainly happened to a very extreme and alarming degree in Tasmania, where the people of Tasmania tried to wipe out the Aboriginal population. And in fact, they chased them on horses almost all the way across the island and ended up putting a very small group that survived onto an island. So all of these things, I think many Australians, including me, are aggrieved that we were never told.
Well, it's not something that we were taught in school, was it?
Yeah, because we have denied it.
Yeah.
So it's obvious that we weren't going to, we never talked about it socially, let alone, actually taught children what happened. We're now coming to terms with all that. And every day, I read the book on The Voice from Thomas Mayo and the great Kerry O'Brien, who's one of Australia's most respected journalists. And there's a chapter in there about the progress of Indigenous Australia trying to have self-determination, trying to be involved in decision-making that pertain to them. It's a really powerful chapter about the different iterations of a voice, in inverted commas. And in that, I was learning things about massacres that I wasn't aware of. And on one sense, I'm aggrieved by that. I wish that I had learnt it. But on the other hand, I'm thrilled and I'm pleased. And in a way, I'm proud that Australia is now finally having these conversations, as difficult as they are. I think in time, we're going to take immense pride out of the fact that we were able to turn around, go backwards. I hope it's this generation. I hope it's this year we start it with The Voice. But ultimately, it's going to happen. I don't think you can hold this tide back any longer. And we're going to look back and say, we were the generation that was willing and courageous enough to say, okay, here's the line in the sand. We are going to now talk about, dispossession, terra nullius. We're going to ensure that the truth of Australian history is told. We're going to make sure that we uncover all of the massacres. We're going to listen to First Nations, because that is now going to inform, the culture and the justice that will underpin the future of Australia. So I think it's an incredibly inspiring path that we're on. It's taken us far too long.
We need to acknowledge it. Was it 1967 with the referendum that Indigenous people were considered flora and fauna up until that point?
They weren't counted as Australians, and most Australians don't realise that federation. So in 1901, the federation of the colonies into a commonwealth. So when the actual country was born in that sense, in the formal sense, it actually came about because many of the various colonies and even the labour movement and so on wanted to exclude Chinese, who'd been, on the goldfields, of course, in Ballarat and elsewhere, and Pacificas and others who were working in the various fields up in Queensland. So the birth of Australia was actually very much about excluding non-white people who Australians at that time thought that they were taking over. So this has been a theme that has been here that's 122 years ago.
Yeah.
Because the first piece of policy brought in to the new Parliament of Australia, Commonwealth of Australia, was called the Immigration Restriction Act. So you imagine all the colonies came together and said, look, we're worried about these things here. We need to have power between ourselves in order to manage these races. And that's why there is still the race power under Section 51 in the Constitution, which right from 1901 gave the states and the Commonwealth, although the Commonwealth no power over Aboriginal people. That's what 67 was about. Because the colonies became states. They actually said, we want to legislate about Aboriginal people in our own areas. You can't do that as the Commonwealth, as the country. Yeah. But you can legislate about any race. It's called the race power. It's if you like, a legacy of 1901 racialised thinking and racism. And it's quite unique. I'm not aware, and I'm pretty sure there's no other provision like that in any other constitution in the world. So it's actually a legacy of, white Australia, because that's what it was at that time. So all of these things are part of our history that we need to understand. And of course, First Nations have been telling us this forever, right? And we just haven't been listening. That's why they're now saying you need to, the voice is about finally listening.
And enough is enough. And it passes on from generation to generation. And I've done a lot of work in the indigenous communities and become very close to communities. I've got to say, when I went, so let's wind it back, it's early 90s, I was mid-90s. A young detective and go into an Aboriginal community up at Bowraville.
Yeah.
I walked in there as a big city homicide detective. I've got nothing to learn here. Yeah. I'm walking into this community. They speak English, therefore there's no communication barriers or whatever. Yeah. Boy, was I wrong. I was just ignorant on so many things, and I stayed close with these the families and the community up there at Bowraville since then, and they've taught me so much. And they would pull me aside and explain things in the simplest of terms. Yeah. Like Arnie Elaine, an elder who's sadly passed away, Elaine Walker, pulled me aside and said, why would I talk? First time I met her, she absolutely growled at me and gave it to me and said, why would I talk to you? You're a white man, you're a cop, blah, blah, blah. Do you know what that has been done to my people? And then when you break it a step back and then sit and listen and you understand the pain that they've been through and why they're angry. That's and right. people make the mistake, my friends, anyone, make the mistake going, oh yeah, but that happened in the past. It doesn't affect us now. But their families were ripped apart. They were destroyed. They were just downtrodden. And it plays on generation after generation. Right. And
exactly. So I often say to people that, had I grown up Indigenous Australian with brothers incarcerated, father incarcerated and uncles, perhaps mother from part of the stolen generation, seeing the way that in many parts of Australia, this ignorance and racism, which is in every institution, and as you're saying, it certainly has been in the police and in many areas of Australia is still there because it's in Australia. Right? Yeah. It doesn't matter which institution it is. It's about not understanding what First Nations have actually been through, or any cultural differences, or not wanting to understand. Then, as an activist, as someone who has spent my life stepping forward when I see injustice, I have no doubt that I would be in prison.
Yeah.
Right? Because I would not have sat at home saying, well, this is perfectly fine. I'm just going to stay out of trouble. I would have been in the protests. I would have been at the front of that thing, and I would have been saying, we need our rights. Now, it only would have taken someone to throw handcuffs on, and you know how it works, okay? Or to be picked up on a street when you're riding a bicycle, and it's your bicycle, and every time you ride it, someone's stopping and saying, mate, where'd you get the bike from? Right? Yeah. And then eventually you say, listen, about up you, mate. Yeah. Right? You've asked me 20 times.
For sure.
Okay, come in, bang, you're in there. Now you're in court. Now you're fined. Well, I can't pay the fine. My family doesn't have any money. So now I get a bigger fine. That means I got a charge. I'm in for 3 months. I'm in there. I get bashed. This is the cycle, right?
You don't get your license.
It's a cycle.
It's a cycle, 100%.
Okay? That's right. And I have this conversation with people all the time. So we have the most incarcerated people on earth. Do you actually believe that Aboriginal Australians have a genetic predisposition to crime.
Yeah.
That is a genetic impossibility. And therefore, the rest of us all have to accept that society is putting them in a situation where they are being incarcerated. Okay. Now, that's not to take individual agency away from anyone, but it is obvious to the rest of the world that our society is set up to incarcerate or put First Nations people in a disproportionate number of situations or type of situations that you and I do not or would never face, where they can be incarcerated. That's just a fact.
And you describe that cycle so well. I see it happen time and time again. Yeah. And it's looking from their perspective. I marched on Parliament 4 times when I was in the police with Barraville. I had a level of protection because I was in the police, but you're marching down Macquarie Street, blocking off the highway, the police are there. Then I marched after I left the police, and I marched in the Black Lives Matters thing, and that was a really that was a potential powder keg. I hadn't been long out of the police, and there was a lot of anger, and it was I was really concerned how it was going to play out. And I've got to admit, like marching down with the Black Lives Matter group, and they had all the right police there ready to go. And full credit to the police on this occasion. They weren't there to intimidate. Everyone was trying to hold back. They saw how bad it could go. But I felt intimidated. And I hadn't realised that it was sort of the closest I got to see from their perspective.
Exactly.
As in, shit, if the police turn it on, we're all in trouble here. And I think people have got to understand that, because it's that little bit of ignorance or lack of understanding. You're not stupid because you don't understand this. You just haven't been exposed to it.
Yeah, and we're seeing this with The Voice, where people are saying, well, why should we look backwards? So, we haven't... Yeah. And again, this all comes to the denial of the way that the country was settled, okay?
Yeah.
And because as Australians, we have this central nerve which we don't like to be touched. We don't like to feel... Because there is... people deny it, but there's certainly a guilt there, because we all know now that First Nations are the price that has been paid for where Australia is today and all the beautiful things that we have. They actually are, they've paid the price for that. And whether it was the introduction of diseases, or I was just reading yesterday about the poisoning of their water sources, and of course, last week the Sydney Morning Herald actually apologised. You might have seen it for the Mile Creek Massacre, which was over 100 years ago. They apologised for their coverage at the time, which was just outwardly racist, basically, saying, look, fair enough. Now they're saying, over 100 years later, we covered it incorrectly. We didn't cover it in relation to law or justice. Yep. We covered it by seeing First Nations people as inhuman, essentially. That path, that's why I say we're on this path now, and we're never going to get off it. And I think that's a wonderful thing, because we're all just discovering what actually happened.
Yeah. I like the fact that you're taking a positive slant on it too, that we are progressing. And that's the way to look at it. If it's negative the whole way around, well, what are we going to achieve? Well,
and people do say, and there are sections of society who don't want it to change. And, and people who have power and authority, never throughout history are prepared to hand any of it over. That's just the reality. So it has to be fought for, and by that I mean protest and law and so on, and being organised and collectivism, and that's what First Nations have done so very, very well. I mean, it's I think last year was the 50-year anniversary from 1972 of the tent embassy.
Yeah.
So the advocacy and the patience and the extraordinary abilities of First Nations to bring us to the table to actually have these conversations nationally, when you consider what's happened, is really quite incredible. So I do think, I think that we're going to get through it, but this year it's the start. The Voice is the start of it, and therefore it's naturally going to receive the most pushback, because there is a huge amount of racism. And, of course, we do have here in Australia now a growing, as I understand it, ASIO say, neo-Nazism.
Yeah, it's scary.
Very scary. Yeah. And that's about white supremacy. Yeah. And that's about this ridiculous concept that people are being, bred out. Whiteness is, they're losing their whiteness and all this rubbish. Yeah. They're also involved in this and pushing back. So that's why I'm saying Australia needs to push through this now. We can't let that type of thinking ever win again. And once we get through this, we're going to be on the other side now talking about the practical steps of moving forward. But it's normal. I think it's quite natural that, there's a huge amount of angst and fighting and carry on in Australia at the moment, because this is the central nerve that goes to our history.
Yeah, that's why it's so contentious.
Yeah.
Okay, let's. We've talked briefly on the World Game, how it brings people together, and I think you had some great mentors in Johnny Warren and Les Murray that you spent. And Les Murray was always speaking about the World Game and the beauty of the World Game, and
he understood it. So he was a Hungarian refugee, right?
Yeah, and
so he was in the middle. He saw what the game did for everyone. He saw how it supported, what we now call multiculturalism, and he also saw the pushback and the racism against many of the communities. And so he and Johnny, I think, rightly felt that the rise of multiculturalism would also be the rise of football. In other words, the growth and evolution of Australia and acceptance of all of our diversity would also be the acceptance of the game. And that when Australia loved the game of football and was successful in it, we would be much more comfortable in our own demography.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah,
makes sense. And it's something that they championed all the way through.
They did.
I want to talk about now the Hakeem al-Araibi story.
Yeah.
This was, I think, it got a lot of people's attention, and you were certainly at the forefront of it. And I followed it, why it was playing out. Yeah. But in researching it here, I'm just sort of horrified of what potentially could have happened with that. So if I just read out, I'll just read out the details just so people understand and put it in perspective, and then I'll get your take on it. Hakeem al-Araibi is a former Bahraini football player who spoke out against the persecution and torture of fellow football players during the Bahrain uprising in 2011. Shortly after, he was arrested for vandalising the police station, an act of vandal that could not have been done because he was playing in a televised football match at the time of the incident. That's pretty significant, isn't it? The old cop in me is going, oh, that's a problem. Okay. Fearing for his life, he fled to Australia, where he was granted asylum. In November 2018, he was arrested whilst on a honeymoon in Thailand on the basis of an Interpol red notice issued by Bahrain, what should have never been recognised due to his status as a refugee. So a red notice is like an international arrest warrant.
That's right.
Yeah. Hakeem was freed from prison and allowed to return to Australia in February 2019 following an extraordinary international campaign by none other than yourself and all the other people that were helping out. Yep. Potentially horrendous story. Can you tell us the details of it?
Yeah, it was horrific. So he, as you say, he had been tortured back in 2012. People in Australia might remember what we called the Arab Spring, when there was an emergence of pro-democracy demonstrations across the Middle East. Egypt and, I'm not sure how much in Saudi Arabia, but Bahrain was certainly one. Yeah. And Bahrain is essentially a government autocracy because the royal family runs the government as well. Which so do many of the Gulf states, for example, Saudi Arabia. And therefore, the citizens came out in many, many thousands and peacefully demonstrated to have a say in who would represent them in government.
And there was a division between the Shia and the Sunni?
Yes, very much, but not entirely.
Right.
So the government and royal family is Sunni.
Yep.
Muslims, and which is one sect, if you like, of the Islamic faith, and the majority of the population is Shia.
Yep.
And they are very, very oppressed, in part because the government and the royal family know that they have the numerical advantage. So your population is another part of Islam, and they have different views and don't always get on in a number of parts in the Middle East. So there is this tension. So the minority rules the majority.
Yeah, which always has the potential.
Right. So the majority come out into the street, but not only Shia. Many Bahraini Sunnis were also wanted democracy. So it wasn't only religious. And then what happened was the government looked at in order to crush it after whatever was a week or so, they relied on their partners across what is a strait across to Saudi Arabia, which is like the big brothers to Bahrain, because they're both Sunni royal families. And Saudi Arabia sent tanks across and crushed a few people and killed people and crushed the democratic uprising, okay, as they do. The son, so the prince of the royal family of Bahrain, went on television and said, here's the footage from the news of showing everyone protesting, just walking on the street. And they circled some of the faces of really well-known people, and they said, these people, we are an island, Bahrain, and there's no escape, and you have now offended, the royal family, and we'll come and get you. Hakeem was one of those. There were over 150 athletes who were rounded up, and many of them, we know that Hakeem was tortured, and many other alleged they were tortured. And the reason was because they were high profile, and so they had social capital.
So,
Okay, get the high profile ones and make an example of them. So they picked him up one night, threw him in. He was only 18 years old. They tortured him by sitting him down, tie him to a chair and smash his legs with a metal bar, saying that we'll break your legs, you never play again, and that, you need to, retract your comments about democracy and whatever. And many of them, and then they were out, and many of them fled. And this story then went around the world. He was actually then playing, I think he was in Qatar, playing at the time when they then put a charge on him to say that he was involved in actually some type of fire that happened in a police station. And, of course, he was playing a game on television at the time when that was alleged to have occurred. But that doesn't stop you when you own the courts, when royal family members are the judges, right? This is the point.
We won't take that into account. We'll just dismiss that.
So this is why, if you look at human rights organisations, why they're so important, because they do research and reports into all of these countries, including us. And... and the right to representation and fair justice and open justice, for example, is one of the key human rights indicators around the world, and Bahrain's very low. In other words, if we want this kid, let's just put a charge on him, and away you go. He came here. He came to Australia. He was in Melbourne playing, and as a refugee, he sought asylum. We gave him a protection as a refugee. And then he got married, and he thought he was safe, so he went to Thailand.
He had citizenship under.
So he was a refugee.
But had protection as in
That's
Australia.
Right. So he was on a humanitarian visa. As a protected refugee.
Okay.
And what that means is that he can travel, and under international law, no country can ever grab him and send him back to where he was persecuted. Okay. So in other words, he might, a refugee might go to Thailand, and Thailand say, well, you've breached our laws, but no one can ever say, we're going to grab you and send you back to Bahrain from where you fled. And otherwise, refugees have no protection and can't travel anywhere in the world. And what happened is Bahrain had been watching him, and they realised that he was travelling, so a red notice was put on him. The red notices are problematic because they're funded, I think, overwhelmingly by Saudi Arabia, for example. So they quickly worked out that we can use the Interpol red notice system to extradite and repatriate dissidents, bring them all home.
There's nowhere you can escape.
Exactly. So they put this, and the Australian Federal Police mucked it up because the computer systems weren't great. And they didn't know. In other words, Interpol red notice came through just before he travelled to Bangkok, and on their computer system, it didn't tell them that he was a refugee. If they knew that, they would have to say, well, hang on, this is being asked by Bar. That's right. So anyway, it was put on him, and so when he arrived in Bangkok on his holiday, 20 police jumped on the plane on the tarmac and arrested him and said, Bahrain wants you back.
Right. And for Hakeem to go back there...
so he'd been tortured, and 2 years before it transpired that there was almost exactly similar case of a young man who also was considered a dissident for whatever reason, and they put in an extradition request improperly. Thailand did honour it. So we already knew that they were likely to do this again, even though they're not supposed to. And this kid got on the plane in Bangkok in rude health. He was fine. He got off the plane in a wheelchair with, I think, broken arms and jaw. And then his family saw him 3 days later in prison in Bahrain, and he's never been seen from again. And I think that was like 6 or 7 years ago.
And that was quite likely the
That's right.
destiny for Hakeem.
Right. Yeah.
All right, Craig, we might take a break now.
Yep.
And when we come back, we're going to talk about the campaign to free Hakeem from this situation.
Okay.
And I honestly, I've got to say this, I just find it quite extraordinary what was done. And yeah, it's these things you can change the course if people get up and fight against injustice.